Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about the new Entra PowerShell module. Remember, a PowerShell module gives us a set of capabilities and new sets of commands. This might be to interact with some type of service, it might be something we can do locally, but now we have this Entra PowerShell module. And in the past, when we think about interacting with Azure Active Directory, now Entra ID, there were a number of different modules. But these originally spoke to the AzureAD endpoint, which is now retired. And with the introduction of Microsoft Graph, everything changed. All of those old AzureAD PowerShell modules were deprecated and retired. So when I think about what is the Microsoft Graph, so the whole point of the Microsoft Graph is that it is a single endpoint. So it's a single point I can go and talk to from an API. It enables me to go and talk to a whole set of different Microsoft services. Yes, obviously we have things like Entra ID. And from there, obviously, I have things like users. We have groups, all manner of different things. We have Windows. And there's different types of Windows information like devices and universal print. Obviously, there's relationships between users and devices. But we had Microsoft 365. And Microsoft 365 has things like, well, mailboxes. We have SharePoint. We have different types of calendaring, a whole set of capabilities there. We had other types of security information. Intune, for example, I can access information from here, and then even Dynamics 365. So you have all of these different types of Microsoft service that I could now work with and communicate through this single Microsoft Graph endpoint. And what we actually talk to here is graph.microsoft.com. And this is a RESTful API. And what the RESTful API means is with REST, if I can speak HTTP, then I should be able to communicate with this. So no matter what I'm really using, if I can speak REST, then I can go and communicate to this. And additionally, what they would also provide is the ability for certain software development kits. So an SDK for maybe a certain type of language. And all those SDKs really do is give me a nice language native set of capabilities that abstract away the underlying REST API, but it's still being called behind the scenes. It's just the SDK makes it more friendly for the language I'm actually using. Now, when I think about RESTful APIs, they're really aimed at developers. And so as part of this RESTful API, what they then released was a PowerShell module for Graph. But this was automatically generated. So rather than having to manually go and create this Microsoft Graph PowerShell module, and remember, this is just a huge set of different capabilities. It would have been a huge amount of work to continually update any kind of PowerShell module that can cover this entire breadth. And so when we write our specifications for these RESTful APIs, there's an open API standard. I think there's version 2, I think there's version 3. What I can actually do is from that specification, there's something called auto REST. And what auto REST will do is go and generate different types of SDK based on that specification. In this case, they used it to go and create a PowerShell module. So from this REST API definition, what they went and created was a Microsoft Graph module. And so it's automatically created. So, hey, this goes and talks to this, and it's using that auto REST, which means they can update it very, very frequently. So at least every month we see a new version released. It could be even more frequently. The challenge, though, if I think about an API, I can get really long API strings to do various things. which means if I'm automatically generating the module, well, those commands that I need can be super long, and it may not even be the most intuitive thing in the world. So they're not scenario driven. Aimed at developers, it's based around a particular type of call I want to make. So if we were to jump over for a second, and what we could see is, well, we can go and install the module. So it's the install module Microsoft.graph, and I'm installing it for the scope of the current user, but I could do all users as well. And if we go and look at all of the different modules that are available as part of this, so I'm just searching for anything where it starts with Microsoft.graph, you can start to see the sheer scope of what you can do. Application, authentication, bookings, calendars, compliance, device management, Entra, well, that's because I've added this in extra, education, files, groups, mail, notes, huge sets of capabilities. And if I was to just look at one of them for a second, if I just go and look at Microsoft.graph.users, and let's look at the unique nouns, so the specific types of objects it can work on. So let's look at that. Well, you start to see quite quickly, it's not the friendliest thing in the world. Some of the commands I would need to use are huge. And if we actually start to dive in and looked at the parameters of these, they're really not geared towards what I, as someone interacting with this, would want to use. They are just super long and really not that friendly because they're not scenario driven. They're not aimed at really a user leveraging and consuming these. They're being built from the REST API that's aimed as developers. And so what we find is a lot of people are still using that deprecated AzureAD module because they've got years of investment in a certain way of interacting that were built by humans, that were based on scenarios, and the effort involved to try and move to that Microsoft Graph is just too much. And so, because of that, we now have a Microsoft Graph Entra module, which you see I've installed in my machine. Now, this is not being automatically generated by AutoRest. So what they've gone and created here is there's a human team behind this. So we now have this graph.entra. Module. Now, it's still calling those same REST APIs. But what's happened now is it's really focused around the idea of, hey, I as a human am working on certain tasks I need to perform, and this has been designed to be more scenario-based. So the idea is, with this, for some of the more advanced types of interactions, let's say, for example, I'm creating an access package, I might need to do 3 different API calls, which means there's 3 different PowerShell commands I would have to run because it's just a one-to-one mapping. Here, they're actually designing these around certain scenarios, so it will perform all of those for you. It's a much friendlier set of capabilities. And if we go and look at this, let's just jump over again and see what we have here. So we would install the module with our install module Microsoft.graph.entra. Now I'm allowing a pre-release because this is early days and I'm using the PS gallery. You want to keep this up to date, so remember to update the module frequently. And if I was to look at my module, I don't think I've actually run anything yet. So let's just list available. If I run this, we can see I'm currently running the .11 version of this. Now, this particular version that I'm running right here points to the V1 endpoint. So if I think for a second about this endpoint, what actually happens is there's a currently it's V1 is the latest version. So if I think about my different endpoints available, there's a V1, which you can think of as the standard released version in what I would talk to. So it would actually be like a V1.0 is the endpoint, but there is also a beta. So if I'm curious about, hey, what's upcoming, I can go and talk to the beta. So when I think of graph.entra, this is talking to the v1.0 endpoint. Now there's also a .beta version, and the .beta version goes and talks to the /beta endpoint. So maybe in development, for example, if I wanted to experiment and see what else was going on, I could go and leverage that. So you'll see right here, I've got the command that you could absolutely also go and install. It is a separate module, so you could have them both kind of side by side. There's the entra.beta. You just have to be careful about when you run commands and specifically using that. Now, once you've got this installed, you connect to your tenant like you did with Microsoft Graph. Now, the important thing here is, unlike with some of the previous modules we had, you set a scope. And the scope is the set of permissions that I'm enabling for this particular session. So for example, by default, it might just be user.read.all. So I can use information about all the users, but I can't change anything. If I try to then run a command that needed more permissions, it would actually kick that out. And it would say, no, you need to go and add these scopes to whatever you're trying to do. And it would tell me the scope I need, in which case I would then go and do another connect MG graph with the new set of scopes required, and then I would have those permissions. Now, obviously connect MG graph is from the Microsoft Graph module. There's also a helper, so I can use connect entra, but I don't need to do both. This really is just a helper for connect MG graph. It's doing the same thing. So you would go and connect to your particular tenant. If I just go and connect to that, you will then go and jump over to your browser where I go and confirm. I would complete any other, maybe if there was MFA, etc. if I didn't already have a strong auth in the session I have over there in the browser. But now I have completed that. So if I go back, I am now connected to the Microsoft Graph. And I can always go and check what are the current consented scopes. If I just get my current context, I can ask it for the scopes. If I run that command, we can see I've got all of these various scopes. Now, the reason I have these additional scopes is because I have run other connects in the past. My token has other capabilities, so they are cumulative. As I go and add additional scopes based on different things I might want to do, it will go and add those to my token. And then there's just now friendly commands. If I go and look at the different types of objects that I support, so I'm just looking again at selecting all the objects, I'm looking for unique nouns, and then I'll sort them. If I run this, I'll now see a much friendlier set of objects that I can interact with. So now it's all Entra, user manager, user memberships, user direct reports, but there's all these different types of things I can interact with now. I could run basic things, for example, like get entry users. So hey, get entry user, I'm looking for search string of John, and let's format it as a table, display name, and male. So if I run that command, oh, now it's asking me to go and consent. But now if I jump back over again, I now have access to that information. So I just piped in from entry user and then formatted to some table. Now, while we're talking of piping, that's actually something super interesting. Because one of the pain points we had, remember piping in PowerShell means, hey, take the output of one command and then send those objects as input as objects to the next command. So I can create a chain of commands and keep passing the objects. I don't just want the text, that's not very useful. The nice thing about PowerShell is it's keeping them as objects, and I'm passing the objects from one command to the next command and the next command. So I can do some really nice things with a single command. And one of the problems we had with the Microsoft Graph today, now I think they're working on this, but the challenge we have is it didn't support piping. So if we go and look for a second, so this is using the Microsoft Graph, and I'm just doing a get MG group, and I'm basically looking for where the display name is JL, and I want to send the objects from that to get MG group member. If I run that, it's asking me, well, I need a group ID, which makes no sense because, well, I just sent it a group ID. Because Microsoft Graph doesn't support piping. However, if I use the get Entra group and do exactly the same thing, and now do the get Entra group member, and then I'll send it out to a nice formatting, if we run that, it works. So one of the fantastic things we have with the Entra PowerShell module is we have pipeline support. I can now send the objects through the commands to another command, which once again gives me that fantastic ability to do nice things. Now, if you're curious about, hey, I talked about it talking to the endpoint, you can always run just -debug. And -debug will show you the actual REST calls. So here, for example, I'm just doing a get Entra user, that same one I showed earlier. But the nice thing here, if I scroll all the way up, it will actually show me exactly what it's doing. So I can see it's doing the method is get, so that's part of REST, and then it's calling that graph.microsoft.com. It's calling the v1.0 version of the endpoint. Then it's inquiring on the user's portion, and then the details. Hey, what I want to select on. We can then see we're searching for certain things around John down here in the bottom. And the responses would then be giving us the detail of all of the objects. So now we can see all of those responses. Lots and lots of fun stuff there. So we can always use that if we need to go and get more information about anything we actually want to be doing. But there's another aspect to all of this. Now, remember I talked about one of the problems was this wasn't super friendly. And so historically what's happened is we had a whole bunch of people that still had their scripts. So we have all their scripts doing various nice things, but they're all based around the AzureAD module. These are all the commands that they're running. So now we have this graph.entra, and you saw there all entra something, something, something. So one of the things we can enable as part of this graph.entra is the ability to turn on an alias for AzureAD. And what's that's going to do is then do translations to the graph.entra. And what's really nice about this, when it's doing the alias, it's both the input and it's the output. So it's going to redo and modify the output to be consistent with Azure Active Directory. And the goal of this now is I don't have to change my script, but this is now, when it thinks it's talking to the Azure AD module, it's not, that's gone, but it's now being redirected over to this alias, and it has over 98% compat. There's a few little things you might have to tweak. They're trying to get some of the best practices into this. For example, you could do -all: $true. Really, you just want to do -all, but I can just do a global search and replace. And there's things in the documentation that walks through this. But now I'll get this really nice compatibility. So if we jump back over here, let's scroll down. So all I have to do is enable Entra AzureAD alias. So if I turn that on, so I run that, I can now do a get alias, and now suddenly I have all of these AzureAD things available. And I could go and look. So what's the new version? So hey, instead of doing get Entra user, I just do get AzureAD user. So all of your old scripts should continue to run. And I'll try the same thing here, get AzureAD user. I'll just execute this, and there's my response. So it's going to give you a really nice compatibility and basically give you more time. So as you think about going through and updating your scripts, it's giving you more flexibility to go and do that. But as I mentioned, it's not just about, okay, emulating what we used to have with AzureAD. The whole point of what they're trying to do here is really make it more friendly and have more of these scenario-based interactions. So you're going to see more and more features being added here to support the various types of scenarios. And they're working very closely with the Entra team. So as new features go into preview, as they go GA, you'll see these customer-centric modules being available as soon as that goes live. Now you may say, well, okay, I've already done the work to move to the graph module. Great. There's no requirement to go and switch to the new Entra module. If I've already done the work, if I'm using the graph module, you can absolutely stay on that. You've gone through that pain. If you haven't, then you're probably going to want to use the graph Entra module. And remember, they're both talking to the same REST API. They're completely interoperable. So I could use a combination of them. Maybe I've already gone and started using the Microsoft Graph module in my scripts, great. But maybe if it's interactive, it's more friendly because it's scenario-based to use the Entra module. Maybe there are some things that's outside of Entra that I want to use from PowerShell, well, then I could go and use the graph module. So you can totally use them. It's a user preference for what makes the most sense for you. They are completely interoperable. So that was it. I just wanted to introduce what this was, the point about, hey, making it more friendly for us human beings and about the scenarios we do and the types of parameters we want to use. It does have this 98% compatibility with AzureAD when I turn on these aliases. So if I have those older scripts, I can finally get rid of the AzureAD deprecated module and get with the current module. Again, there's a few little things because I want to bring best practices. So you might have to do a few global search and replaces for certain things, but they're in the documentation. But it should really make things a lot easier for you. And you do have that choice that if I want to play around with the beta endpoint, there's a .beta version of the module. I hope that was useful. As always, till next video, take care.